Welcome everyone to the IGP Directors Seminar. Lovely to have you all with us today. It's a very great honour for the IGP today to welcome Anneliese Dodds, who is the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Labour and Cooperative Member of Parliament for Oxford East. And she is the first woman to hold the position of Shadow Chancellor. Anneliese Dodds was elected to the UK Parliament in June 2017. And before that, she served as a member of the European Parliament, serving on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, focusing especially on clamping down on tax avoidance by big companies. She was also responsible for tightening the rules on financial services to help prevent any repeat of the global financial crisis. And before becoming a member of the European Parliament, Anneliese worked for many years as an academic, and she has a PhD in government from the London School of Economics. And we're very pleased to welcome her today to give us a talk entitled Delivering a Jobs-Rich Recovery. So Anneliese, please could I offer you the floor?
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Moore. It's so lovely to be with you all this afternoon and wonderful to have this opportunity to address you. Very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards as well. Now, too often during the course of the last year, the milestones that we've passed have been desperately sad. This week, we passed a much more positive milestone, with a third of all adults having now received their first shot of a vaccine. That is such good news. I want to pay tribute to all of our fantastic NHS and GP staff and volunteers who've made that possible. I also want to thank all the scientists, lab technicians, nurses, trial volunteers and support staff, including in my own constituency of Oxford East, whose work helped lead to vaccine breakthroughs in the first place. Hope is on the horizon. And with that hope, our thoughts can turn to the kind of recovery we need following this awful crisis. We can lift our eyes to the kind of country we want to be as we come through the other side. The UK needs to become the best place in the world to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. Action to achieve that ambition can't come soon enough. After a decade of the foundations of our economy being weakened, we need to start strengthening them and building towards that better, more secure, greener future now. We will only be able to do that if we are honest about the state of our country and the state of our economy going into this crisis, because we know that our economy was not working for everyone. 10 years of Conservative-led government left our economy on shaky foundations, even before coronavirus hit. For families up and down our country, too many indicators have been heading in the wrong direction. The cost of childcare rising twice as fast as inflation, so that British parents face some of the highest costs in the developed world. Opportunities falling, with the year before the pandemic struck, seeing the lowest number of young apprentices in a decade, and a huge 36% fall in the number of disadvantaged people starting an apprenticeship. And wages stuck, just 1% higher on the eve of the pandemic than they had been 10 years before. Indeed, the Conservatives have overseen the worst decade for pay growth in generations. Costs up, opportunities down, wages flatlining. That decade-long squeeze on living standards has contributed to the most depressing statistic of all, 600,000 more children living in poverty since the Conservatives took office. For too many people in our country, life was already uncertain and insecure. 1 in 4 families had less than £100 in the bank, and as a result were financially unprepared should the worst happen. Some 3.6 million people were trapped in insecure work, not knowing from week to week how many hours they would be able to work or how much income they could expect as a result. Yet even those headline national figures don't tell the full story. It was not an even picture across the whole country. People's job security, income and prospects were intricately bound up with where they lived. Under the Conservatives, we've become an increasingly unbalanced nation, a country out of kilter. People living in the north of England, for example, are less likely to have a degree and more likely to be paid low wages than people in the rest of the country. Life expectancy varies radically depending on where you live, with a child growing up in a deprived area in the Northeast expected to live for 5 years less than a child growing up in even a deprived area in London. That is not the natural order of things. It is not preordained. There is no iron law that says people in Bradford or Oldham are destined to have a shorter life expectancy than those in Bracknell or Orpington. Yet for too many people in our country, it has become the reality, predestination by postcode. With such shaky foundations, it comes as no surprise that when the pandemic did hit our country, it hit harder than elsewhere. But this was made worse by government decision-making during the last 12 months, which has not alleviated that hit, but intensified it. The government was too slow to lock down, too slow on testing, and too slow on getting vital protective equipment to our frontline workers. As a result, when the first lockdown did come, it lasted longer and was more severe. We had the same problem again when indecision and confusion around the Christmas break then led to the current lockdown, which is stricter than that in many other countries. The British people have showed unbelievable fortitude and sacrifice during this crisis. By staying home when asked to do so, they were doing their bit to give our NHS the vital capacity it needed to save lives. But the government didn't fulfill its side of the bargain. That first lockdown should have been used to get a proper grip on its test and trace system, so that as the country emerged from lockdown, we could keep the virus under control. The government refused to work with local councils, those who know their communities best, and instead spent £22 billion, including in outsourced contracts to the likes of Serco, on a system that for months failed to deliver what was needed to get the virus under control. Contrast that with developments in Labour-run Wales, where responsibility for test and trace was given to local government and local public health boards from the outset, and where a much higher rate of contacts were traced. That failure, combined with the endless chopping and changing of economic support schemes, has sapped people's confidence, left businesses unable to plan, and seen a second and then third national lockdown applied. Little wonder, with that kind of approach, that we not only have had the worst death toll in Europe, but also the worst economic crisis of any major economy. Again, this has not been an experience evenly felt across the country. Over the period of this crisis, people in the north have experienced a larger fall in their mental well-being than people in the rest of the country. They've been more likely to have their working hours reduced or to have lost their jobs altogether. They've been more likely to die of COVID-19. Rather than a response to those problems, last year we had the indignity of the government playing regions of the country off against one another. Local leaders like Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham and Dan Jarvis were forced to ask of government the support that families and businesses in their areas desperately needed. They were compelled to engage in a series of murky negotiations, which were actually anything but. Everyone emerged with the same one-off payment of £20 per head of population. This was not designed to meet the needs of local businesses, nor was it linked to how long a local area had been or would be subject to public health restrictions. So Manchester and Liverpool had to make their £20 a head stretch for months on end, while Cornwall's money only needed to last for the 4 weeks of the second national lockdown. Those 10 years of rising inequality have as a result been followed by a year in which that trend only got worse. And the Chancellor's response looks set to make it worse again. While it was his government that wasted and mismanaged billions over the course of the past year, he seems determined to make ordinary families carry the can. Unless he changes course at next week's budget, families face a triple hammer blow to their household finances. Pay freezes for our key workers, £20 a week cut from family budgets for those needing universal credit, and the prospect of a giant hike in council tax because the government won't give councils the funding they need. And yet again, these hammer blows will fall harder in some parts of the country than others. The TUC has shown that key workers in the North East, North West and Yorkshire and Humber will suffer the biggest hits to their spending thanks to the Chancellor's pay freeze. And if those key workers have to tighten their belts, They have less to spend in local businesses and on their high streets, trapping the local economy in a vicious downward spiral. The same is true of the Chancellor's insistence that local authorities hike council tax, which makes up a larger proportion of disposable income for poorer households than it does for those who are better off. People in lower income regions like the North West and Yorkshire and in Wales will be hit more by this regressive policy than those in the South East. Rising inequality before the crisis hit, rising inequality during the year of the pandemic so far, and the risk of rising inequality as we begin to recover. That is the Conservatives' legacy when it comes to management of the UK economy. We cannot go on like this. A balanced economy is a better performing economy. Closing the gap between our best and worst performing regions will boost growth. That's why Labour has been clear that this has to be a recovery that works for all parts of the economy and all parts of our country. A recovery that brings growth and prosperity to every corner of the UK, instead of concentrating it in a handful of places and hoping that this will somehow magically spread outwards. A recovery with people, their families and their communities at its heart. A recovery we can be proud of. And next week's budget, we already know some of what we're likely to hear from Rishi Sunak about the Conservative solutions. Grand sweeping statements about infrastructure investment that make for a good soundbite, government by press release and photo call. But after more than 10 years, people are getting wise to this. They know that what matters is what comes after the cameras are switched off and the headline writers have moved on. And they know by now that on this score, the Conservative record is one of failure. 6 years ago, the Conservatives announced £2.3 billion to build 60,000 starter homes. Not a single home has been built. In the last 7 years, the Conservatives have re-announced or recommitted to major rail projects in the north more than 60 times. But we've not seen so much as a spade in the ground. A garden bridge that existed solely in Boris Johnson's head somehow still cost the taxpayer £43 million. We've seen a relentless cycle of over-promising and under-delivering. The same is true of their trumpeted announcement to move more civil servants out of London and into the regions. Spreading government jobs around the country is an admirable aim. But once again, the government's track record here runs in precisely the opposite direction to their stated ambitions. In the last 10 years, we've lost 65,000 civil service jobs in England. Almost every region has lost jobs, with some hit harder than others. The East of England, for example, has seen 3 in 10 civil service jobs go. I say almost every region because there is one exception, London. Here, the Conservatives have overseen a 6% rise in civil service jobs. So as they've let people go in the regions, they've concentrated them in the capital. Meanwhile, the investment that communities really need has gone begging. The North, the Midlands, the South West, Wales and Northern Ireland have between them been missing out on £4 billion a year of R&D investment compared to other regions. £4 billion a year. That's the same as the government's much vaunted Levelling Up Fund across its entire lifespan. If government investment is going to make a difference to every part of the country, we need to set out some clear tests for what it should deliver. It should be focused on reducing the productivity gap between regions. It should halt and then reverse the widening of educational and health inequalities between regions. And it should ensure that there are better quality jobs in every corner of our country. For years, the Conservatives have used the catch-all justification of Brussels to explain away why they haven't been able to invest strategically to deliver these sorts of outcomes. Often that's not even been true, but now it's no excuse at all. They say they want to do things differently. Well, we will hold them to that. We want to see every pound of public money working overtime for local people and their communities. Rather than setting up a piggy bank in Westminster and getting local councils to fight it out for access, we would work with communities to determine their needs and to invest where it will make the most difference. Public investment should come with a commitment that wherever possible, it will create local apprenticeships, that local firms will be involved, that people living nearby will have access to the jobs that are created, that where value is created locally, it's captured locally. Labour's already putting this into practice and has been doing so for years. In Labour-run Wales, the government has developed a new economic contract between government and business based on the principle of public investment with a social purpose. Businesses seeking Welsh Government support must commit to growth, fair work, reducing their carbon footprint, and promoting health and learning in the workplace. Unbelievably, we heard yesterday that the UK government will overrule Cardiff on this when it comes to the new Levelling Up Fund. Rather than being allocated by the Welsh Government, who understand Welsh needs best and have put in place a strategic and responsible approach to public investment, this will now all be dispersed from Westminster. Welsh people now have no guarantee that investment will come to their nation, much less that it will deliver the decent jobs and sustainable outcomes that Welsh Labour have embedded into their approach. As another example, Manchester has put the idea of social value at the heart of its public procurements for years. In 10 years, it increased the proportion of money spent locally from 50% to 70%. That represents an additional £138 million in the local economy, supporting over 500 apprenticeships, over 1,500 jobs, and over 7,500 employment opportunities for hard-to-reach people living in the local area. And in London, Sadiq Khan has introduced the Good Work Standard, a voluntary code where employers commit to go above and beyond the bare minimum legal requirements when it comes to how they treat their staff. Sticking to that code boosts the ability of those businesses to win public contracts. These are the smart, community-focused actions that must be at the heart of our recovery, to ensure that where public money is spent on boosting our recovery, it delivers for every part of our country. There are a whole host of ways in which government can do this, but today I want to focus on three. The first is much greater transparency. The next few years require a considerable amount of capital spend from government. People across the country have a right to know exactly what that's being spent on and what difference it's making to their local area. Public sector contracts are supposed to include a 10% social value requirement, such as commitments around local jobs or training opportunities, but the government can choose to waive that in certain circumstances. People must have the right to know when that happens and why. This should be public information. Secondly, the principle of social value must be embedded in public investment and not an afterthought. The creation of a new national infrastructure bank, an initiative which Labour has been calling for ever since the Conservatives sold off the Green Investment Bank, offers an opportunity to do this. Social value must form a critical component of the mandate of the new National Infrastructure Bank when it's announced next week, along with ensuring the bank delivers for every part of the country. Those people across the UK who've been able to build up savings through this crisis should also be able to obtain a stake in the work of the bank through the launch of British recovery bonds, as Labour has called for. And thirdly, good jobs and decent work must be at the heart of government investment. Government should start by learning from the pioneering work Sadiq Khan has done in London and create a national set of good work standards so that wherever businesses are signed up to these, it increases their chances of winning government contracts. It's this strategic approach to government investment that will mean it genuinely makes a difference to people's lives and their communities. But we know that rebuilding our economy is also about making sure that people can once again have a sense of pride in their communities, in the places that matter to them, where they can come together. Our high streets used to be that beating heart of our local communities, and they can be so again, but they've been battered by this crisis, and they were already struggling to begin with. In the 5 years from 2015 to 2020 alone, we lost 7% of our high street shops, with over 32,000 more stores closing than opening. And the crisis has only exacerbated this trend, with almost 8,000 shops lost in the first half of last year alone. More than 1 in 10 shops in the UK were sitting vacant by July. This matters, not just for the jobs that our high streets support, both those who work in them directly and those who work in the supply chain, though that is undoubtedly important, but because high streets are a central part of how people feel about their community and their local area. I'm not blindly nostalgic about our high streets. People's spending and shopping habits have been changing for years, And we are never going back to a world where Woolworths, Debenhams and House of Fraser stood side by side in huge retail units up and down the country. But nor does that mean we should just abandon our high streets to a sad, disorderly fate. If we act smartly and strategically, we can recapture the hearts of our communities and make them part of a better, brighter, greener future. Unfortunately, on current plans, the Conservatives risk accelerating the decline of our high streets and even seeing some of them lost for good. The Chancellor so far refused to heed Labour and extend business rates relief and the reduced rate of VAT. Our high streets businesses face huge bills in just a few weeks' time that will hammer their prospects of recovery. But that's only the beginning. New Conservative rules that are due to come into force in the summer risk a mass sell-off of our high streets over the heads of local communities. Until now, if a landlord wished to convert an old shop into a flat, it required planning permission, including giving local people a say as to whether this was what they wanted and making sure those homes were decent. A vital piece of protection to ensure people had a stake in what happened to their high streets. From August, all of that will be ripped up. Local people will have no say at all, and landlords will be able to use a fast-track process to turn shops into flats, bypassing many of the standards we normally expect for new homes. They would be under no obligation to provide any outdoor space, nor to contribute to community infrastructure or affordable housing. This is a bad idea at the best of times, but right now it could be catastrophic for local communities. Businesses will be placed into direct competition with the residential housing market after a year in which they've been hammered and from which they will have barely begun to recover. Unable to compete with the high prices that residential properties can command, we risk seeing a giant sell-off of our high streets, all in one go. Local people won't have any power to stop it. And once those local amenities are gone, they are highly unlikely ever to come back. For smaller high streets, the loss of several shops at once could be the point of no return. Of the 1,200 towns tracked by the local data company, 1 in 3 have 100 shops or fewer, right on that tipping point. So we're calling on government to scrap these plans as a matter of urgency, to hand back power to local communities, to give them a say in securing their high streets. That's not to say a blanket ban on converting shops into homes. There will be circumstances where that's the right thing to do, but only with the consent of local people and only where they can be guaranteed that where new homes are built, they're to the highest possible standard and they contribute to the local community through shared resources and affordable housing. Securing our high streets and stopping them being sold off is just one part of the puzzle. We also need to do more to rebuild our high streets so they once again become the thriving heart of our community. That means action to encourage new businesses and other enterprises onto a modern, resilient high street. We should not try to recreate the past, but we should support the small shops, cafes and public spaces where people will be able to meet again. Labour's called for an expansion of the Startup Loan Scheme to support 100,000 new businesses across the UK over the next 5 years. And with that expansion, we want to see funding earmarked for particular regions and nations, reversing the situation at the moment where 1 in every £4 lent under the existing scheme has gone to London and just 1 in every £20 to the North East. These new firms can help breathe life into our high streets, with 3 in 10 small businesses already being located on or next to the high street. And where there are persistently empty shops blighting local areas and not being filled, we should give local councils the power to step in, just as they can with persistently empty homes already. 40% of small businesses say that making vacant units available for rent is one of the biggest changes that should be made to help their high street. Where these are not coming back into use via the market, we would create an empty shop order, giving local councils the power to take them over, bring them back into use and offer them to local businesses or other enterprises. Once this is successful and the councils have recouped their costs, the landlord should begin receiving rent again from the property. The government should look to use the newly expanded Dormant Assets Fund to provide loans to councils for this purpose. Done well, everyone should win. The local community gets a diverse range of new services on the high street, a new enterprise has got the foothold it needs to start work, and the landlord sees rent coming back in again. Powers for local communities to secure and rebuild their high streets are a key part of making sure the recovery works for every part of our country. But they're not the whole answer for our high streets. For that, we need government to make good on its long-standing promises to overhaul the outdated business rate system, including action to level the playing field between bricks and mortar firms and their online rivals. We also need action to ensure that communities can continue to access cash and banking services on their high streets. 3/4 of small businesses have seen bank branches close on their high street, with which estimating that branches have been closing at a rate of 55 per month. Again, this shouldn't be about preserving an aspic the way things were 20 years ago. But we can't just have a disorderly retreat from cash that leaves those who most rely on it with nowhere to go. The government promised action on this a year ago, and we've still seen nothing. The pandemic has only made the need more urgent, and so they must come forward with legislation at next week's budget. The recovery from COVID-19 will be no recovery at all if it only delivers for a minority of people or for a handful of areas of the country. It will not be a recovery if we revert to how the world was in December 2019 and pretend that it was working for everyone. We know that wasn't the case. 10 years of Conservative rule have fundamentally weakened the foundations of our economy, and in some parts of the economy has eroded them altogether. We need a government that is genuinely committed to doing the hard yards when it comes to rebuilding our communities, not sticking around for a photo op and a headline and then moving on, but working hand in hand with local communities to deliver the outcomes that they want, making sure every pound of public money invested is delivering value locally in terms of jobs, training opportunities, business contracts and the environment, and empowering people to secure and rebuild their high streets, the beating hearts of their communities that have taken a battering over the last 12 months. That is what a recovery for every part of the country truly means. And that's what a Labour government would deliver. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed listening to that. And it raises a whole set of, I mean, this is a very, very challenging time for everybody, isn't it? And not least for those who are suffering most through this pandemic. But I'm a little bit concerned about the kind of language that's already creeping back into ideas about how to tackle this problem. So we've heard a lot in the last few days about fiscal credibility, fiscal conservatism, a sort of an idea in a way that sounds a little bit to people like me as though instead of having an actual plan to do anything about this, we have a sort of return to rather well-worn ways of thinking. So, I mean, do you see, I mean, what do we need to do to actually open up our public discourse around this? Because of course, in general, the public like fiscal conservatism. I mean, that's part of the problem, isn't it?
Well, I certainly share the public's appetite for ensuring that public money is spent wisely, but I think that's very different from lurching into what could be a very premature fiscal consolidation that you're right is being touted in some circles currently. I have to say it's not being touted by expert organisations. It's not being promoted by the OECD, for example, or the IMF. You know, they've stated very clearly that it's important for countries to get back on that road towards recovery, that it's really critical that they actually secure their tax base before they start changing how they tax it, that they really push demand back up again, you know, preserve jobs and businesses right now. So that really should be the focus currently. I think it's very important that we really underline quite how economically damaging it could be to be, as I say, lurching into that approach of trying to consolidate right now, when particularly the UK economy is in a very weak position. It would be very damaging.
Yes, and it's really links to something you said very early on in your talk, when you said that, you know, when value is created locally, it needs to be captured locally. And we've talked a lot about that in the work we've done in the IGP, saying, using a slightly different word, saying that value needs to be curated locally. So it needs to be used locally to create more value rather than just being pulled out. And of course, all of this stuff about fiscal consolidation is really about further extraction of value, really, from the economy. So one of the things I'm kind of interested in is, Why do you think, or do you think we could, with the Labour government, use a kind of different kind of stimulus plan like the Americans have, rather than, for example, just having an infrastructure building spree? I mean, what is the real value in such a plan?
Well, I think it's really important that we recognise the drivers of local growth, actually, and what creates that value locally. And, you know, currently, as I talked about in my remarks, we have a situation where some of the very people who would be most likely to spend, who've got the highest marginal utility from spending, to use the economic term, they're the ones who are actually seeing their incomes being reduced because of what's happening with council tax, for example, because the public sector pay freeze that will impact on people like teaching assistants, for example, you know, not highly paid individuals. And actually that will be causing economic damage at a time when we do need to be building up demand. I would say that, of course, there's a role for infrastructure spending, most definitely. And we would say actually that the UK's plans in that regard are very far behind where many other countries are aiming. I mean, you mentioned the US example, but we've also been really contrasting the UK's approach, particularly to environmentally focused investment, with the approach being taken in Germany and France, where we see a much more ambitious approach. So we do need to have that infrastructure spending as well, make sure that it's really targeted at ensuring we move towards that more secure economy of the future. But we've got to have that focus on family finances as well. We need to have that focus on different local economies as well. Unless we do that, we won't have those strong foundations for the future that will lead to more sustainable growth into the long term.
Yes. And that's the problem, is people's disposable household incomes. I mean, that's really the nub of the problem for ordinary people, because, you know, the government has recently also talked about moving away from the original industrial strategy that was developed under Mrs. May, for example, and not going back to that. So then the question comes is, where will these new jobs come from? I mean, what are these new jobs? Because in the work we've done across the UK, we've seen that of course, innovation is important, technology is important, but many of the new jobs that are talked about, or many of the investments in innovation that are talked about in industrial strategies, don't actually produce high numbers of jobs. They produce actually lots of investment and small numbers of jobs. So where does this leave ordinary people? What kinds of jobs could we create, do you think, going into the future?
So, well, I think there are a number of areas where actually there is a potential win-win here, particularly at the current time where very sadly we're likely to be seeing that peak in unemployment coming through, you know, in the next kind of 12 to 18 months. And actually during that time period, a strong focus on, for example, promoting retrofitting of homes where, you know, the training lead-in time is relatively short, where very sadly we have energy inefficient homes right across the UK. You know, this is not a concentrated problem. It applies right across the UK, where you could have that employment generating potential switched on relatively quickly, actually, if you had the correct government investment and incentives created. Now, we've had a kind of slightly slipshod approach to this, had a Green Homes grant proposal from government, a programme from government. It's not being delivered well. In fact, it's actually shed jobs because it's being delivered so chaotically. We do think that having, you know, a much more sensible and thoroughgoing approach to this, using where there's already local institutions, you know, local authorities, local enterprise partnerships and so forth, that could be delivering that genuine industrial strategy that we think we need to see. But we would also say actually that, you know, entering this crisis, you know, a number of our services were experiencing recruitment crises. You know, if you think about social care, for example, we had 120,000 vacancies in social care approaching this crisis. Now we need to deal with some of the training gaps and some of the aspects around recruitment that apply to those parts of the public sector, but actually focusing on areas where we already know that we need to have more recruitment, and thinking about how that can be part of the future for jobs as well will be very important.
Yes, that's extremely important. And also keeping the longer term in mind, which must be quite difficult. And for you as Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, thinking about the longer term as we face an immediate crisis is one of the, in my view, nightmares of being someone who has to make political decisions. And here, of course, we have you know, the immediacy of the problem, but we also have the fact that in a sense we're addressing a problem which is a problem of the present. It's not really the problem of what's going to happen next in the economy, which is of course increasing automation, change, and so if we robotics, and so as we push into that structural transformation, increasing deindustrialization probably of the UK, it's not going to go, we're not going back to the old factories, so nor are we going back to a new kind of service sector either. So it's where is that sort of debate, do you think, for you? Where are the real challenges there?
I mean, I think that's a really fascinating question. And I think it's absolutely critical that policymakers do try and pull their head up from the everyday and think about the longer term consequences of their policies. I mean, it's one reason why, for example, with the furlough scheme, we said from the very beginning that there should have been a training element within that scheme. I mean, there is in a number of other countries with their wage support schemes. Now, actually, there has been, in theory, a kind of training portal that's included, for example, access to digital skills, skills training through that portal, but very, very few people who've been furloughed even know that it exists, let alone having used that training. So we do need to be thinking for the future. You know, if these kinds of schemes are going to be lengthened, which we said should be the case for the furlough scheme while we've got those health-based restrictions in place, and actually they should be including training so that we're building towards some of those new jobs of the future and actively helping people who are in that situation. I would say more generally, around industrial strategy, it is about really thinking through how digital infrastructure impacts on all parts of our economy. You know, until now we've had a sector-based approach, which, you know, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think actually, you know, some of the sector deals around, you know, biochem or around automotive, for example, I think they've been relatively effective. You know, they've brought together big employers, trade unions and government, but we need to be looking at those cross-cutting issues as well, and that most definitely does include access to digital infrastructure, you know, thinking through how we can really push that down, also particularly for small businesses, because so often it's the very biggest players who will have access to that technology already. They'll be using it already, but their suppliers won't be necessarily, and other local companies won't be. So we need a much more joined up approach to this.
Yes, that integration is important. Well, there are a lot of questions backing up for you because it generated a lot of excitement here. So the first one is from John, and he's saying, when capitalist giants such as Gates, Carney and Zuckerberg say that capitalism will not and cannot provide solutions to problems such as climate change and pollution, for example, and Mark Carney is on record as saying it's for governments to determine the role of the state, should we now remove the debt on the money supply and provide individuals with what some describe as universal basic income? So are you in favor of universal basic income, I think?
Well, I certainly think we've seen the flaws of a system during this crisis, which hasn't provided what it's meant to on the tin, social security. People have not had that security through this crisis. You know, very often people have become unemployed during this crisis for the first time, and they've been shocked about the fact that, you know, for example, they have to wait for 5 weeks before they receive support. If they put away a little bit of savings, that's knocking out their ability to actually get support. So that system clearly has not worked. We need to ensure that it is reformed for the future. My colleague, Johnny Reynolds, he's been working on this as our Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, thinking through how can we really have a system of social security that's fit for the current century, you know, rather than the last century. We need to have change there. In terms of, you know, what's often called a universal basic income, I think the challenge that I have around that concept is that it means very different things to different people. So there's a huge amount of baggage with that concept. You know, some people would say it means taking some conditionality out of the social security system. And, you know, if we're talking about people having quicker access to social security, you know, I would very much agree with that. I don't think people should have to wait for 5 weeks until they receive that support. If, on the other hand, we're talking about taking the whole social security budget, putting it all in one bucket, and then dividing it amongst everybody so they all get the same, I don't think I could accept that, because that would mean, you know, somebody who had much more substantial needs, you know, a single parent with a number of children, for example, in a high-cost area, they would then be receiving the same amount as somebody like myself, for example, who's got, you know, a greater ability to cover my costs. So I do think it does depend really on what exactly people mean by that term of universal basic income, I'm afraid. But, you know, do we need reform of our social security? Well, we most definitely do.
Well, that's very interesting. We've got a question now coming from Andrew Percy, and he's been working with me and the team in the IGP on universal basic services, which is something that we have proposed from the IGP. And so he's asking how the UK will get out of this sort of downward spiral of insecure livelihoods, declining investment and falling productivity. So it's a sort of reinforcing set of problems. And he's saying that the three big ideas that are around are universal basic income, which we just talked about, but universal basic services and employment guarantee. So do you just extending that argument about universal basic service, universal basic income, do you see any value in the idea of employment guarantee or in universal basic services? So investing more in services to make sure that people's household income goes further, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think we must be bearing down on the costs that people experience. I think there's no question about that. So, you know, if you consider the hardest impact on many people's income in the UK, it will be around housing. And we know we've got a crisis around affordable housing. You know, what's called affordable isn't genuinely affordable. We've seen a big reduction in the availability of social housing over time. We really do need to be increasing the supply of genuinely affordable housing and of social housing. And obviously that's something that Labour is working very hard on, something that is very important to us. And we think if you were able to bring those costs of housing down, then actually that would help us deal with some of these other issues. You know, if you think about how much of the social security budget is taken up with housing benefit, for example, in the UK, such a significant amount, or obviously the housing element within universal credit now for those claiming universal credit. I would say, though, that out of the core elements that were just mentioned, I think it's really critical that we do look at the labour market. I think we've seen, you know, over the last few weeks and months in particular, quite how unstable our labour market is in the UK, you know, how weak the protections are within it. We've seen many practices during this crisis which have really made people's labour market situation, you know, even less resilient. If you think about things like, you know, fire and rehire, where people have been sacked by their employer, taken on worse conditions. That's of course legal in the UK. People have been astonished to find that that can be applied to them, quite rightly astonished, because it should not be allowed at all. So I think we do need to have that focus on the labour market. I think it's critically important. We've got a real kind of vacuum in that debate on the government side right now. They don't seem to be clear about whether they're going to reappoint a head for labour market regulation or not. It's not clear when the employment bill is coming through. We've obviously had a momentous court case around Uber's treatment of its drivers last week, but that then needs to be followed up with legislation so that we can ensure that people do have that security. So let's make sure we have that focus on the labour market as well. I would say that's a really critical element.
Right, so that's the central part. So we have a question now from Jackie McLeod, and she's asking or saying, all of what you're calling for could be met, in her view, through a well-being economy. And a number of countries like New Zealand, Iceland, Wales, of course, whom you mentioned, Scotland, Finland, Costa Rica, and a number of cities have made the decision to sort of move away from a GDP focus to a well-being economy. And she's asking if you could explore whether you think a well-being economy would be the right way forward for the whole of the UK.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some really fascinating work undertaken around this issue. And, you know, there is no doubt that ultimately that measure of GDP, it does capture some useful things. I certainly think there's a role for it, no question about that. For me personally, I do think it plays a role. However, it does not capture either the extent of economic activity, nor, very importantly, the extent of wealth in different communities, whether we're talking about individuals' wealth, public wealth, or indeed the wealth of the natural environment. And I'm sure that people saw a very interesting report which was produced, actually commissioned by a previous Conservative government, by Professor Dasgupta, setting out there the fact that, you know, if you only use GDP as a measure of economic activity, then actually you can have some very perverse outcomes. You know, if you, for example, raise a forest in order to then, you know, plant grain, you'd only then be measuring the positive impact from selling that grain, you wouldn't be at any point measuring the reduced capacity that you have, if you want to put it in those terms. I mean, obviously it has other value as well, but the reduced capacity from the biodiverse forest that you had there previously. So certainly it does have problems. I think it's really important that we open up the debate, and those examples that the questioner mentioned, I think are really, really interesting ones. And I am aware of the use, particularly that's been made of well-being in Wales. I think it's a very interesting model to look at.
Yeah. Now we have a question now, Anneliese, from Richard Partington from The Guardian, saying you talked about a Tory legacy of inequality and a need for balanced growth coming out of COVID. Also, how Labour would be responsible with the public finance, but would the fairest and most responsible policy not be a rise in corporation tax in this coming budget, especially when there is anger at profits boosted by the pandemic, such as for Serco, as seen today? And would you support an increase in corporation tax at next week's budget, or is Labour comfortable to be to the right of the government on this issue?
Yeah, well, there's clearly a discussion to be had around corporation tax. Obviously, the UK's corporation tax rate is lower than that of many comparable nations. And, I've always been clear that I think it's really important we do have a more progressive tax system, but also one where we have less of a gulf between how businesses based on bricks are treated for tax purposes. Obviously, business rate's a big issue for them, compared with those businesses based on clicks, where there are many, many anomalies actually often in the tax system affecting them. So we do need to have that conversation. But I would say there's a big question about whether we need to see immediate changes to the tax system coming in and applying to businesses and to families right now. I mean, the government, as I talked about in my speech, it's going ahead with an immediate imposition of a very significant council tax rise. That is the wrong decision to be taking right now. And I think it's the wrong decision. If government's saying that they will be immediately imposing tax changes on the UK, I do think that's the wrong decision. I think that's going against the vast bulk of what expert commentators are saying. If we're talking about a longer term trajectory, then let's have that discussion. Let's make sure that we do have that more effective tax system. But I think for the here and now, really the UK government's focus should be on jobs, growth, preserving economic activity. We have had the worst economic crisis of any country in the G7. So we need to be focused on reversing that decline, that reduction in the size of the tax base, and not on immediately trying to increase how much that tax base is indeed taxed.
Yeah. Thank you. So we've got a question from Sam Lunn-Rockcliffe, and he's saying, thank you for a very interesting talk. And community-focused action is, of course, a hugely important framework for thinking about an inclusive recovery. But I felt that your talk missed a central talking point about our relationship with the environment. And could you please speak a little more about the role the environment needs to have in the recovery process?
Well, it's clearly an absolutely fundamental one, and Labour's set out a number of times the fact that we think we need to have a green economic recovery as well as one which produces a more secure economy. In fact, I would say that the two are synonymous. I mean, we've known since the time of the Stern report so many years ago that actually the most significant threat to our economic prosperity is that from the climate crisis. And that Dasgupta report that I just referred to underlined the impact of the crisis in biodiversity on our future prosperity as well. So we do need to ensure that we're promoting above all that green recovery that I talked about. I think, as mentioned before, there can be a strong win-win here. As we were talking about, there are ways of generating employment, supporting employment right across the country, which will help us to meet our net zero goals at the same time as helping us to ensure that we help those who've become unemployed and that we really get our economy going again. So I don't think the two are separate. I really think they've got to be integrally linked. And I must say, when I talk to business, very often they've got the same view. They want us to be having that recovery, which is focused on the green transition. They view that as important for our economy into the future. And I really think government should be on their side on this, rather than having the, I would say, pretty lukewarm approach that we've had. The UK only, for example, committing to as much environmentally focused capital spend as what Germany's spending just on hydrogen as a green technology. That really isn't the kind of ambition that we need to have in the UK. We need to be much, much stronger.
Yes, an interesting talk we had at the IGP last week about regenerating soils and managing water better, which would of course reduce the costs to the economy of massive flooding. So there are some easy win-wins here that could be further explored. So Paul Stevens is asking, there have been structural and productivity issues with the UK economy for many years, but there also seems to be a moral or ethical issue relating to the differential rewards people receive for doing their job. What is acceptable and what is not? And do you see this as an issue? And how can we move to a more equitable reward system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an incredibly important question, and it's one that's been thrown into very stark relief during this crisis, particularly if we look at sectors such as care, for example, where up to a quarter of social carers actually report that they don't even feel they're actually earning the minimum wage because of the fact that they've got to travel between appointments and, you know, the other features of their employment. And frankly, that is a moral disgrace. It is a disgrace that those very people who do so much for all of us when we become old, or indeed for younger people as well, if they need that help, that they're so poorly rewarded. And that must change. You know, it's why Labour said that, you know, obviously we shouldn't be cutting pay for public sector workers, but also that we should be ensuring that as we fix the social care system, which we desperately need the government to do, that having that much fairer pay that really reflects the nature of those jobs must be fundamental to that new settlement. Very, very important. But I would say that this is important much more broadly across the system as well. I mean, we've had, as I said in my remarks, a situation where we've seen extremely slow pay growth. The average pay only 1% more at the end of the period of Conservative rule than at the beginning of it. That hasn't been a feature of the recovery in many other countries. Why has it happened in the UK? I think there are many reasons for it. I don't think we've had strong enough regulation in many areas. I don't think the trade unions have been given the capacity actually to perform the function that they have in many other countries, and ensuring that, again, there's that win-win, that there's, you know, that strong commitment of the labour force to employers, the productivity enhancements from having unionised workers, as well as those positive pay impacts as well. And in fact, there is quite a bit of evidence that, you know, when you have a focus on tackling very low wages, that actually that can promote productivity as well, because it creates then a shared endeavour with employers being focused on enhancing productivity, on making sure that the investment is there, as well as obviously having a much better situation for workers, and they have more commitment to their employer, and so on and so forth. So again, it can be, you know, a really positive thing on all sides, trying to tackle that low pay problem.
Yes. And we've got a follow-up to that, Anneliese, from Penny Bernstock, who's saying there's an increasing recognition of the need for something far-reaching in the post-COVID times on the scale of beverage. And how can we ensure that housing and employment markets are more aligned to ensure that there's effectively housing that maps to living wage workers and is genuinely affordable? In other words, less than 35% of total income. Can we do that?
Well, I think that we can, if we're sufficiently ambitious and if we put the right measures in place. And I would agree with Penny, and indeed Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, last week talked about exactly such a beverage moment. This is a time for us to really consider whether we are aiming for the, you know, the secure economy, the better future that our country needs. But I would say it's also shown, you know, this crisis has shown that when we work together, when we are ambitious, what we can achieve. And I think it means that we shouldn't accept any longer that situation where there is such a lack of genuinely affordable housing. And, you know, for a long time, Labour in particular has said that that definition of affordability should not be the one that we use, because it is not genuinely affordable, actually, when you're talking about such a small proportion of people's incomes in an area, of people's wages, then being able to pay for that accommodation. Instead, we need to have more sensible measures. We need to really tackle that dearth of housing development in different areas. we also, of course, need to make sure that housing, and this links to some of the previous points, that housing is actually energy efficient. We've been moving backwards in the UK in that regard, with some of the housing standards that were being proposed by the Labour government when it left office actually being stripped out of the system. That should not be the case when we're aiming towards net zero.
We're picking up again on job questions, and this is from Nikolai Mintchev. And thank you very much for your talk. And a new study was published today by King's College London on perceptions of inequality. And the study found that almost half of the public see individual performance as an important or very important factor in people losing their jobs during the pandemic. And do such perceptions matter for the future recovery of the UK economy? And how do findings like this impact future recovery strategies in your view? So perceptions of inequality.
I mean, that sounds like a really fascinating piece of research. I must go and take a look at it. And, you know, it's quite interesting because I think people's views around the nature of the employment impact of this pandemic have changed over time. So it'd be quite interesting to know, when that survey was actually conducted, because I think initially, well, certainly from the government side, I'm sure people will remember this whole debate around, in inverted commas, viability, and whether particular jobs would be viable into the future, and some almost intimations that some of those jobs which were really at risk, that in a way, Conservatives almost implying that, well, they're not viable for the future, and they kind of got in a bit of a tangle around, jobs in performing arts and so forth. I think that actually, I mean, from my impression, people are in a very different place, and they recognise the fact that when we do get through this very difficult public health period, that, for example, sectors like the creative and performing arts must be part of our recovery. They're absolutely fundamental to it. I mean, I'm well aware of how much they contribute to our exports, but of course they were growing before this crisis. They're not actually sectors that will not be viable for the future. And of course, there's a contribution beyond just raw economic terms, their contribution to the quality of life as well, to our culture and so forth. So I do think that actually we need to be considering these issues maybe in that longer term time frame. And I think when I talk to individuals and to businesses right across the country, the overwhelming sensation that I get is of people wanting to support each other through this recovery, wanting their area to get back on its feet and to get powering again, to create those new jobs. That's the impression that I get when I talk to those businesses. But I will take a look at that survey. Sounds very interesting.
Thank you. We've got a question now from Christopher Harker, and he's a colleague of mine at the IGP. So he's on the panel. So he's going to ask you himself. Chris, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anneliese. My academic training is as a human geographer, so I was delighted with the geographical nuance. And I know some of my colleagues like Amy Horton are with us and probably also enjoying the geographical sensitivity and nuance. What I'm interested in these days is debt and finance. And in a sense, the question I want to ask you picks up on a lot of the questions that my colleagues and other attendees have asked. So let's actually imagine that whether Labour come to power or the Conservatives remain in power, that your vision for jobs and, as Henrietta put it, curating value locally is realised to a very large degree. Does this actually solve some of the fundamental problems we have around debt and finance in our society? So what work is doing is it's really underpinning the debt economy. So on the one hand, those who aren't in work often have to use very high cost forms of credit. But on the other hand, and much more to a much greater extent in quantitative terms, work is underpinning the enormous mortgage payments that many of us have to make, and the kind of broader system. Now, I appreciate in your discussion of housing and work how you're kind of working a little bit around the edges of this problem. But what are your thoughts about addressing the power of kind of banking and finance, and particularly the kind of way of thinking about society that emerges from a background in finance, which of course, as well know, many of our politicians have? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, goodness, so many elements of what you said that are very interesting. I mean, I suppose I would say that when we look at many of these issues, it's very important to consider what I would call, the balance of returns, right, to different forms of economic activity. So I gave a lecture a few weeks ago where, I pointed out that actually in terms of, what I would view to be the drivers of growth, there's been very, very little focus on some pretty fundamental questions, I would say, in the UK. So there's been very little focus on the extent of competition, whether we've got that right, whether we see too much monopoly. I think we really do. But secondly, we've also seen very little consideration of the relative returns to assets as compared to the returns to labour and to innovation. And actually, you look over time at the UK economy and you see how those returns to labour, to people's work, and returns to innovation, how compared to the returns to assets, that ratio is kind of widened over time. And we talk about it, very, very infrequently, but I think we've got to face up to that. We've got to face up to why have we got that gulf. We've got to somehow push the returns to work up. We've got to ensure that when there is innovation, that's rewarded. And then we need to be in a situation where there isn't such a focus for people on ensuring that it's just assets that are viewed as, a secure way to ultimately improve their living standards. I mean, you may well have seen the proposals that Labour made last week around a British recovery bond. Now, that was trying to open up some of this discussion and saying, look, where people have been able to amass savings during this crisis, of course, lots and lots of people haven't. More people have lost income during this crisis than have actually built up savings. And of course, some of those savings will be spent, and we want them to be spent so that we can get the economy going again. The Bank of England says only about 5% of them will be spent. So then you've got those savings there. Now, some evidence suggesting that actually quite a lot of them could be flowing into, for example, property, because that's an asset that people view as safe, as a place to ultimately keep their money safe. Well, actually, if you had a recovery bond as an alternative, drawing on that kind of national solidarity that we've seen through this crisis, then you could help to, for example, capitalise the National Infrastructure Bank that the government's already committed to. So I think we do need to be looking at these issues differently. I suppose just in relation to your point around kind of individuals who've worked in finance and that kind of thing, I have to say, I think there's quite a variety of different viewpoints that are circulating right now. I should be very open here. I come from a small business family, so my dad was an accountant, a particular view, I guess, of financial matters. I chaired a debt and welfare advice centre, so I have a particular view of particularly personal finance matters. When I talk to individuals who work in financial services now, I think there's a lot of debate that's opening up, particularly around more inclusive economies, greener economies. I think there is quite a vibrant discussion. It's quite an exciting time. And we need to make sure that excitement actually builds towards change so that we can have that more secure and greener economy for the future.
And we have a question now from Left Terrace Kritsos, who's saying, many thanks, IGP, and many thanks, Anneliese, for your talk. Has Labour in mind to experiment with a collective working time reduction to promote sustainability and prevent greater inequality and the deepening of labour market segmentation trends? So can we work less?
Well, I think this is a challenging issue right now because, of course, so many people have seen their hours reduced involuntarily. They haven't wanted to see their number of hours go down, but that has happened. And of course, that's for very many people had an incredibly negative impact on their income. Many people who are already struggling being impacted by that. So I think it's very important that when this is talked about, there's not some kind of suggestion that there should be an across the board reduction, because actually lots and lots of people are desperate to increase the amount of work that they're able to do and to have much more security around it. Now, I think ultimately the kind of wage support schemes that we've seen delivered in many different countries, they've enabled that kind of, I suppose, sharing of work, in particular workplaces when demand is reduced, then they kick in and top up wages. Now, to an extent, the furlough scheme has worked like a version of that. I would say, again, when the Chancellor hopefully extends that next week in his budget, as mentioned before, he needs to include training as a core element of that. He needs to stamp out the abuses that sadly have been present within the furlough scheme. But he also then needs to be working with businesses and trade unions and thinking through, for those sectors that are going to be subject potentially to restricted demand for a long period, what kind of support is going to be needed so that we can preserve that economic capacity, we can keep people in work, not lose their skills, keep them ultimately able then to be going back into full production once we get back into a more normal economic situation. So I think it is something that needs to be looked at, but that shouldn't be kind of muddled up with a reduction of people's hours overall because of the fact that so many people have had that happen to them and it's actually been extremely negative.
Yes, they need more income, not less. So Alex Brown is asking, successive governments of every flavour have slowly boiled the frog of regressive taxation with rises in VAT. Most companies pay far more in VAT than any other tax. If there's going to be a discussion around corporate tax, will part of that be a reduction in regressive indirect taxes?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, I would put in that bucket of taxation that at the very least isn't progressive, the current council tax regime as well, which is become increasingly problematic, particularly with the removal of council tax relief, which happened kind of under the radar in the vast majority of areas of the UK. It's had to be reintroduced actually by the current government because of the enormous strains on family incomes. But that just indicates, I think, how problematic that council tax regime is, how unfair it is for so many people. I mean, I think that there does need to be a focus on these issues into the future. Obviously, as a Labour Party, we're discussing these issues with our members, with trade unions, with businesses, and we will be setting out our proposals in advance of the general election. But I think it is important, that we kind of reflect on what's happened during this crisis in relation to some of those taxes and, quite how problematic some of this situation has become. I would say also when it comes to, for example, business rates, a sunk cost doesn't reflect profits, obviously, because they've got to be paid regardless of what a business is doing. That system, again, has been shown to be very problematic during this crisis. So I do think that it must be looked at into the future.
And of course, VAT has an impact on household consumption as well. So Saffron Woodcraft, who's on another colleague at the IGP, is on the panel and she'd like to ask a question person. Saffron.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your really wide-ranging contributions. So I have a question about community voice. You talked at several points during your talk this afternoon about the importance of accountability and transparency and local values and priorities. I just wonder if you could say a little about the mechanisms for doing that in a meaningful way, but specifically in relation to economic policy, so that being an area where communities often don't have an opportunity to reflect local priorities in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Saffron. And I agree with you. I think that this is an area where we do need to see change. And, I come at quite a lot of this actually as a Labour and cooperative MP, as was mentioned before. It's one of those things that lots of people find a little bit surprising that there's a cooperative party as well as the Labour Party, but they very much work together. And I've set up a cooperative recovery task force actually with the cooperative party, which is looking into many of these questions, because actually we've got some incredible examples, I think, of really innovative work right across the country where you've seen communities that have been able to engage in that activity of trying to secure their high streets as places that people want to go to, making sure that, for example, iconic buildings are preserved, that there's then a space for new businesses, startups to operate in, community facilities as well. And that's often been achieved through cooperative mechanisms. It's been achieved through social enterprise. It's been achieved through responsible businesses working very, very closely with local communities. There are a number of ways in which we need to, I would say, unlock that potential. So, kind of watch this space, because we're going to be developing those plans into the future. And I know that my colleague, Steve Reid, who's our Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, this is something that he's really passionate about as well. He used to run what was, I think, one of the country's, if not one of the first, then the first cooperative council in Lambeth. He's very much focused on how you really can have that engagement. And I'd say sometimes when people talk about these things, they sound a little bit airy-fairy perhaps, but actually the reality is we know that particularly when areas have been subject to severe economic decline, very, very often it will be those community-based businesses, whether they're social enterprises or cooperatives, that are the first to move in, and then they're also the last to leave if communities are under stress economically. They're very resilient compared to other forms of business or of organization a lot of the time. So this makes economic sense, hard-headed economic sense, as well as making sense for other values as well.
Thank you. And now we have a question from JP, and he's saying Tax Watch's recent Equality Before the Law report points out that DWP investigations and prosecutions for benefits fraud outstrip those by HMRC on tax fraud, despite tax fraud costing the Treasury 9 times as much. And this apparent inequality before the law is dwarfed by the size of accumulated tax subsidies for which no productivity gains are evident. How would Labour redress these inequalities? Would you stop sweetheart tax deals or cut subsidies for unproductive exploitation, etc.? So how would you promote productivity without substituting labour for capital?
Oh goodness, well I'll perhaps deal with 99% of that question, because the very last bit is quite a big one.
Yeah, yes, it is. Take it as you like. Take it as you like. Yeah.
I mean, on the taxation aspects, I mean, the reality is that we've seen a huge amount of turbulence in HMRC, so in the revenue collecting services over the years. We've seen a programme which was meant to be delivering more efficient services, which actually, unfortunately, has just led to enormous job losses, including very often, kind of related to the discussion we were having, very often in towns and smaller cities where that employment was absolutely critical. And therefore, we do need to be focusing on HMRC's capacity for the future, because we already know, based on the evidence, that when you have an adequately supported tax service, that it's able to pay for itself, because it's able to then take that resolute action against those particularly larger companies that are not, unfortunately, paying the tax that they should be paying. So I do think that's going to be absolutely critical for the future. It's even more important, actually, with all the strain on customs that we're seeing currently and the turbulence that's being created by the kind of last-minute approach of the government to those Brexit negotiations. So we've got to deal with that enforcement side. We then do need to tighten up on all of those loopholes that exist. And this is something that I've been working on for many years, where we still have far too many anomalies in the system. And then I would say, finally, around the overall taxation piece, we really do need to be getting those international agreements that are so critical. We know that there's very large amounts of profit shifting, unfortunately. Still, we had some international agreements through the OECD, but we haven't seen that move forward, and it really needs to for the future if we're going to get the change that's necessary. So a lot to be done, but I think actually there's enormous promise there if we can harness that those possibilities.
Yeah, thank you. So Juan Manuel Moreno, and he's saying, thank you for a great conversation and talk. I wanted to know your thoughts about how people who are outside the system for a number of reasons, so disabled, refugees or seeking asylum or destitute, can have an active role in these recovery plans, from the revamping of the social security system to the need of developing a green and well-being economy. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that question, Juan. And I think it's incredibly important that we do really see that strong recovery, but one which is inclusive as well. Because if we see huge numbers of people missed out, then we simply are not going to be building towards the kind of economy that we all want to see. We're not going to be having the kind of communities that we all want to see. I mean, Juan mentioned people with disabilities, and I think it is really important to focus on what's taken place through the crisis. We've actually seen, really appallingly, very heavy impact of the health impact, of the health situation on those, for example, with learning disabilities, people being far more likely, horribly, to have severe health impacts if they have a learning disability. But then we've also seen that really strong impact also on employment status as well. So very often people being really the first out of the door, actually, if they have a disability, when there have been redundancies made. We've got to face up to that for the future. Now, that means actually, particularly with the employment support packages that government is putting into place, first of all, they've got to be radically simplified, and we'll be seeing a lot more about that over the next few days. They've got to be expanded. They really shouldn't be only covering 1 in every 100 young unemployed people, for example, as they are in the case of the Kickstart scheme. But they also need to be making sure that those people who, for example, have disabilities, that they are included so that they actually can be accessing those employment opportunities, that they're decent employment opportunities as well, and available all across the country. And, again, I don't think we've got to remake the wheel on this. I've been really inspired by some of the examples in different parts of the country. If you look at what Blackpool Council has done, for example, the Labour councillors there, they've had a really effective scheme helping people into work, into good opportunities, including many people with disabilities who weren't employed before. I think with that kind of really targeted approach that's based around local institutions, we can have really positive impacts and make this a much more inclusive future.
Thank you. So we have a question now from Matthew Davies, who's a colleague at the IGP, and he's going to ask it in person, I think. Matt.
Thank you, Henrietta, and thank you, Anneliese, for a wonderful presentation. I've got a slightly different question. So I'm quite interested in the broad sort of structures and values that we create to ensure societal resilience in the long term. And it strikes me that at times of crisis, political parties are often able to work together productively to develop a sort of shared mission. And I guess Labour has, to some extent at least, already managed to support the Conservatives at times during this crisis. And so, to my mind, long-standing regional inequality, local and regional inequality, is such a vast and long-standing, almost perpetual crisis, which we're now seeing the extent of because it's exacerbated by COVID. And this is such a depth of crisis. Does it need to be something that now transcends party political issues in some way? So how might political parties work more productively together to address inequality and create resilience across political cycles? And perhaps a little cheekily at the end, I might ask, how might you work with the Chancellor on this?
Well, it should ultimately, and thanks so much for that question, Matthew. It should ultimately be an imperative for all political parties. We cannot accept the current levels of both inequalities between regions and also within them as well. As you say, this has become more marked. It's been thrown into stark relief during the current crisis, and we must deal with this. It's not just important, of course, for those who are disadvantaged as a result. It's very bad for our economy as a whole. It has a knock-on impact on all of us. We know that countries which have lesser extents of that kind of regional inequality, where it's not growing, where we don't have those gaps in regional productivity, that they tend to have more sustainable economies overall, actually. So it's something that we've all got to be focused on, I think, as political parties. I would say that, a stepping stone towards that in very concrete terms is really making sure that we've got mutual respect, I would say, when it comes to decision making around many of these issues. And that means, getting beyond what's I felt has been really quite a kind of conflictual approach during this crisis. We've seen it with how the Conservative government, London government, was having those arguments, to be honest, with the Mayor of Manchester, where he was trying to defend businesses and people in his city, and there's this really conflictual argument going on. We had a similar thing with Wales as well, when Wales wanted to have a circuit breaker earlier, and the London Conservative government said there was no way that they could have had a furlough scheme available to them to do that. And then just a week later, they said, actually, we will let we'll let England have it, kind of thing. That lack of respect, I think, really doesn't help. I think we need to, regardless of political party, make sure that the structures are right. And there are examples that can be followed here. If we look at, for example, what took place in Wales. So every week, as I understand it. There's a meeting of all of the local councils with the government in Cardiff. Now, they're of a whole bunch of different political persuasions. You know, obviously, you've got many different parties reflected in Wales, but they meet together. They've got that mutual respect. They talk about the different issues. They share the information, the public health related information and the economic information, and they come to a shared, or they have until now, from my understanding, they've come to a shared understanding about what needs to be done around, for example, reopening or the imposition of restrictions. I think that kind of approach really does need to be followed for the future. As I say, I think Wales has shown how it can be done. Now we need to see that kind of resolution right across the country. And, you know, in terms of your last question, if the Chancellor would like to work with me on these issues, I would be absolutely delighted. I'd be delighted if he took on board, you know, what we're calling for and what I was asking for during this lecture. I've got to be honest with you, I'm not sure that he will, but I'm certainly going to keep pushing for that outcome.
Thank you. And we now have a question from John, who's saying lots of jobs could be invested in by government, which would provide a public good. So cleaner environment, better services, infrastructure, and alternatives to profit generation, including raising standards of care and recycling, to name but two. Rather than extending commercial loans, I feel. But how do you propose to address climate change and pollution, damaging agricultural and fishing practices, recycling, reuse, reduction of plastics, etc.? So the environment question again.
Yes, and you know, a really, really big set of questions there actually about employment impact as well. I mean, I would go back again to say that, you know, Labour believe we need to have a green economic recovery. We set out in a report a number of months ago ways in which, if we had that kind of recovery, if we pulled forward capital investment into the next 18 months, that we could generate employment right across the UK. And that would include actually employment in areas like nature management, where, you know, there's enormous potential for the future actually. I mean, far too often, I think in the UK, we look at the countryside as a place where people might live. We don't look at the countryside as a place where people need to work. Beyond farming, of course, that's important, but there's so many other forms of employment that we need for our countryside, which we haven't had that focus on from government. So, you know, I do think that, you know, those proposals, you know, I really want government to be engaging with them, rather than, I would say, that the very lackluster and weak approach that we've seen so far when it comes to a green economic recovery. But then I would say also that that question was a much broader one. It was about our resource use much more broadly. And I think there, you know, there's a lot of appetite actually from business, from local governments, from different regions, to be particularly developing what's often called the circular economy. So an economy where, you know, you have much less waste, where you ensure that, you know, if there are, for example, waste products, that there's a, you know, a really a clear line there in order to remediate them, that actually this is something which can produce employment into the future when you have that more circular use of resources. And I've been talking with and working with Liam Byrne, who's the Labour mayoral candidate for the West Midlands, and he in particular has been focused on this, talking to, you know, local industrialists, trade unions and others, you know, really exciting plans about how you could make, you know, in his terms, the West Midlands, that kind of green workshop, how you could create that through having a focus on green manufacturing. Now, what's going to be necessary to deliver that? Well, we will need to see that capital investment so that we can see transition, particularly in very energy intensive industries. And, you know, we've set out proposals around how we could achieve that. But we also need to be, for example, looking at the planning system. You know, it's really, really hard at the moment, a lot of the time, to have co-location of those different facilities. Government's actually removing some of the levers from local areas to be able to deliver those kinds of clusters of different facilities that are so necessary for that circular economy. So, you know, I really do think there's a lot of potential there, but we need to see government taking action right now so that we can benefit from it.
Thank you, Anneliese. I'm very, very mindful of your generosity and your time. And I think I'm going to just take another couple of questions, and then I think we've exhausted you, but let's go for the last two. So Jackie McGlade again asking, our regulators persist in pushing for lower prices in bills for resources, whereas consumers see the need to invest in climate resilience. Can you say how you might tackle this, i.e. listening to the voices of the people in what they would prefer?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is just to do with the pricing structure, actually. Yeah, I think there are many different reasons why we've ended up with the kinds of systems around delivery of utilities that we have at the moment. I mean, I do think that the broader regulatory context is very important. You know, if you think about energy, for example, you know, just one case of this, you know, I live in Oxford and we've got two really big projects taking place, which are looking at how we can decarbonize energy. One of them is based on assuming that the grid will continue, so-called super hub, essentially an absolutely enormous battery. The other one is based on assuming that it won't continue in its current form, that we'd have a completely decentralized system of localized grids. You've got both of them taking place at the same time. Now, they're both pilots, and you know, I think the people working on them, they're fantastic, really innovative. But actually the time for these kind of pilots, you know, was 10 years ago. It's not right now, when we need to be ensuring that we have that energy system fit for the future, with a regulatory system that's fit for the future as well, that really enables communities to have much more control around this. And, you know, when I talk to industry about this, you know, they're very frustrated about the situation, as well as consumers. So making sure that that regulatory context is right, that it supports the transition, I think is going to be very, very important. But I think we've also got to recognise, as I said, some of the other developments that have taken place. If you look at water, for example, what took place with Thames Water, where we saw, you know, really substantial debt actually being loaded into the system, that's then been a drag on the kind of investment that we need to see. We need to be really focusing on how we can try and avoid those kinds of developments into the future. We argued, for example, I'm sure that people will have seen the review into competition under Penrose that was released, you know, a while ago. We said that was a bit of a missed opportunity, really, because there was no focus on issues like debt leverage, which we think, you know, are very important when it comes to ensuring that we have that much more sustainable, secure economy for the future.
And the final question tonight, we're sort of lifting our heads out from the UK. So Johnny Darling is asking, where would you like to see the UK on the international stage in the coming decades in terms of influence, leadership, and cooperation on global challenges?
Well, I would say, first of all, to Johnny, that of course the biggest such challenge for us is that COP conference, which is coming up very rapidly now, only a few months away in Glasgow, where it's absolutely imperative that we ensure we do get that much stronger global agreement for the future. We've got to be very ambitious around that agreement. You know, we all know that there is a climate emergency now. It will become an increasing economic emergency. In fact, it's already having an economic impact on the UK, as we know, because of the impact it's had on our critical infrastructure. We saw that with what happened in the Northeast with the railway disaster there. So we need to have that strong agreement. The UK's got to be exercising a strong leadership role there. As you'd anticipate, we as the opposition are trying to do all that we can to try and make sure that we have a successful agreement. We've also got, of course, the G7 leadership that needs to be exercised by the UK government as well. And the Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy is working very hard on that, trying to make sure that we use that role for good, that we use it to deliver on our country's priorities, but those, of course, of the world when it comes to some of those global challenges as well, around security, in particular around combating both, you know, the potential for future pandemics, but also organised crime, for example, and fraud and those kinds of matters. So a huge amount to be done, where we've got to be ambitious for our country, and we've got to really make use of those opportunities. I would say particularly those that are coming towards us at a real rate of knots this year.
Yes, it's going to be a challenging year, and I think the Dasgupta review is a very good move in the right direction in terms of what will happen. I just want to thank you very much indeed, Anneliese, for a spectacular talk and a spectacular performance under considerable amounts of firepower from the IGP and the associated group. which I have to say is quite common. But thank you so much. We feel very, very privileged to have had the opportunity to talk to you, and it's been great fun, as always. Very great. It's very interesting and lively and enlivening in general. Because we have a panel here, and because we're able to do something that we haven't been able to do for a long time for anybody, but we can do it every time at the Director's Seminar, we're just going to give you a round of applause to give our thanks. So thank you.
Oh. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We hope to see you in the IGP again, and good luck